It started with the crunch of gravel and the glint of an unfamiliar SUV pulling into the long, winding path that led to my front porch. I was on the porch sanding down a reclaimed cedar beam, just enjoying the solitude when I noticed her. Designer sunglasses, clipboard in hand, fake smile, the telltale signs of an HOA Karen. I didn't have a homeowners association, not legally, not on this stretch of land, but she believed otherwise. "Excuse me, sir," she called out, her tone coated in politeness but sharpened with entitlement. "You can't just put up a cabin here without board approval. This is within Alpine Ridge jurisdiction." I didn't bother correcting her. Not yet. I let her speak, let her list her grievances, something about cabin siding, tree trimming, mailbox height. She wasn't interested in facts, just in control. She said I'd be fined, that code enforcement would be notified, that I'd be hearing from the committee. I watched her walk away down the gravel road, heels wobbling slightly, thinking she'd won a battle. She had no idea that the very road beneath her feet, the hill she drove up, the forest that whispered around us, it was all mine. I didn't just own the cabin, I owned the entire valley. That night, I pulled out the old manila file my grandfather left behind. Inside were worn deeds, dusty survey maps, mineral rights, and utility easements. Everything I needed to remind myself what kind of power lay buried under generations of silence. My family bought this land in 1928, over 5,000 acres, allodial title, the highest form of land ownership predating even the county. I flipped to the stamped legal document, Alpine Valley Holdings, Monroe Family Trust. I was the sole trustee, and she had just threatened the wrong man. 2 days later, she returned, this time with 2 uniformed officers. I kept my calm as she pointed toward my cabin, claiming illegal development, disturbing the terrain, code infractions. I handed one officer the certified deed and smiled. "This land isn't part of Alpine Ridge HOA. It never was. In fact, you're trespassing right now." The officer blinked, stepped back, studied the paper. I saw his posture change. "Looks legitimate," he said. Karen's face flushed. "There must be a mistake," she snapped. "No one owns that much land anymore." "He does," the officer replied, "and from what I see, your HOA has no jurisdiction here." She stood there, mouth twitching, gripping her clipboard like a lifeline. Her power deflated, but I knew this wasn't over. People like her didn't quit. They escalated. A week passed. I started noticing odd things. My mailbox smashed, my security camera cables cut, petty vandalism. Dead fish dumped at the edge of my property line. HOA notices ducked, taped to my gate even though it clearly said private property. Then came the drone. It hovered just above treetop level, circling, filming. I tracked it to a blue house on the ridge, her house. She wasn't just playing HOA president. She was trying to break me. I filed a formal cease and desist. I warned her, but she responded with a formal complaint to the county about unauthorized woodland development. Except, I had the permits. I had everything. Still, the inspection cost me 2 days of peace. The county guy even apologized, embarrassed, said she wouldn't stop calling. I knew it was time to push back, not with threats, but with the truth. I contacted the local paper. A journalist friend owed me a favor. I handed him the whole story, the legacy of the Monroe land, the allodial title, the overreach of an HOA drunk on power. When the article ran, her name wasn't mentioned, but everyone in the valley knew exactly who it was about. Her neighbors started whispering. Some even emailed me privately, thanking me for standing up to her. But I wasn't done. I began clearing brush along the old trails that led through my woods, right behind her fence. I hired a team to install vintage style signs, Monroe Valley Hiking Trail Public Welcome. I made it clear that anyone could walk the land. I opened my valley to the people. Her control started slipping, and she hated it. One morning, I found her standing at the base of the trail, arms folded, screaming at a group of hikers. I stepped out of the trees, calm and collected. "Problem?" I asked. "They're trespassing," she shrieked. "This is HOA land, actually," I said, holding up my phone. "This is my land, and these folks are my guests. You, on the other hand, are the one trespassing." Again, the hikers stared, confused. One man looked at the map on his phone and said, "Nope, she's wrong. This trail's been marked as Monroe property for decades. She stormed off, furious, defeated again, but I knew she was just getting started. Karen wasn't just some nosy neighbor, she was dangerous. She had friends in zoning, friends in law enforcement, and I had just challenged everything she believed was hers to rule. The valley had been quiet for years. But now it was waking up, and the fight for who truly owned its future had only begun. The first snowfall of the season came early that year, blanketing the valley in soft white. Most saw it as beautiful. Karen saw it as a problem. She marched out with a clipboard, her snow boots squeaking against the frosted pavement as she snapped photos of unauthorized snow piles. She scribbled furiously into a logbook, as if the snow itself had violated HOA code. That morning, I was splitting firewood near the cabin when I heard the unmistakable crunch of angry boots. I didn't look up. I didn't need to. You can't leave your wood stacked that high, she snapped. It's a fire hazard. I calmly wiped my hands and turned. That's on my land, Karen. Her nostrils flared. This entire area is under our community guidelines. You're violating half a dozen rules. I didn't argue. Instead, I picked up a log, turned it in my hand, and tossed it onto the stack. She stormed off, promising fines, citations, legal action. I watched her disappear behind the trees, her red scarf trailing like a warning flag. A week later, I received my first letter from the HOA, fines totaling $200 to $300, violations included snow accumulation, non-compliant cabin color, and excessive chopping noise. The absurdity was laughable. But this wasn't about noise or paint. This was Karen staking her claim. She thought she could bury me under bureaucracy, run me off my own land with paper bullets. I ignored the first notice, then the second. Then the third. The letters got bolder, red text, legal threats, words like escalation and lien. I went to town for supplies and caught wind that Karen had been making the rounds, telling people I was squatting, that the cabin guy was violating zoning. The grocer said she filed a complaint with the county. I wasn't surprised. Karen never knew when to stop. What she didn't realize, what she couldn't even begin to fathom, was that the very documents she waved at people were built on land I owned. Not just the cabin, the whole road, the entire valley. Her house sat on land leased by my great-grandfather to a long-defunct mining company, who sold it to a developer who went bankrupt. The title lines were still active, buried in paperwork no one but me had dug up. That winter I watched as Karen launched a crusade. She erected new signs, ugly plastic things warning of HOA jurisdiction. She put up a speed bump at the edge of my road. She called animal control on my dog. She had a drone flying over my cabin daily. It hovered, whined, beeped, like a metallic mosquito buzzing with pettiness. I found it crashed one morning in my creek. I left it on her doorstep in a bucket of ice. No note, just a gesture. Meanwhile, neighbors were beginning to whisper. Some were fed up, others were scared. Karen had built a network, people who believed in rules for the sake of rules. They held late-night meetings, passed new restrictions, rewrote bylaws without community input. I stayed silent, patient. I knew something they didn't. I wasn't just some stubborn woodsman. I had documents, maps, deeds, legal muscle. I'd been preparing for this day since the moment I inherited the land. The valley was more than soil and stone. It was family, memory, blood. Karen saw it as a subdivision. I saw it as a legacy. Then came the police visit. 2 officers in a squad car showed up at my gate. They said there'd been a report of suspicious activity involving unauthorized construction and firearm noise. I nodded, showed them my permits, asked if they wanted coffee. They laughed, said I was clearly being harassed. They didn't say her name, they didn't have to, but Karen wasn't done. She began pushing for the county to reevaluate land boundaries. She tried to get emergency easements passed. She filed for a court hearing, but I beat her to it. My lawyer filed a claim of ownership over the road, citing documents dating back to 1893. Then I made my move. I hosted a valley gathering, open invite. Bonfire, cider, music. People came, curious, nervous, but they came. I didn't give a speech. I didn't ask for sides. I just let them see the land, the peace, the space, the freedom. Karen drove by, slowly, staring. The firelight flickered in her windshield. She didn't stop, but I saw her face, and for the first time, She looked uncertain. That was the moment I knew. The storm wasn't over, but the tide had turned. The snow had only just begun to melt off the upper ridges when Karen made her next move. After failing to intimidate me with citations and threats, she decided it was time to bring in the big guns, law enforcement. One cold morning, I heard the rumble of tires crunching along the gravel path outside my cabin. A black and white sheriff's cruiser slowly came into view, its lights off but presence unmistakable. Karen followed in her shiny silver SUV, practically grinning like she'd already won. I stepped onto the porch, coffee in hand, silent as the deputy exited his vehicle. He was a local man, Deputy Cole. I remembered when his daddy used to hunt elk with mine. He took off his hat, nodded politely, and explained that a complaint had been filed about an unauthorized structure. In the woods, Karen stayed behind him, arms crossed and smug. I didn't even have to argue. I simply handed Cole the deed, pages long, dated back over 100 years. It clearly marked the cabin, the ridge, the forest, and the road winding down to the valley floor as part of the Monroe Land Trust. Cole squinted, recognized my last name, and gave Karen a side glance that instantly erased her smirk. "Ma'am," he said slowly, "this man owns the entire valley, including the private road you just drove up." Karen's jaw locked up. She tried to protest, claimed she'd been given jurisdiction over the area due to recent HOA expansions. But Cole wasn't buying it. He thanked me for my time, shook my hand, and warned Karen that if she filed another false report, she could face fines, or worse. The moment they drove off, I knew Karen wasn't done. No HOA president ever admitted defeat with grace. Days later, strange things began to happen. Markers along the hiking trail went missing. A for sale sign appeared suspiciously close to the cabin, as if someone was trying to imply I had vacated. At night, I heard the distant echo of construction equipment, unauthorized, unannounced. When I followed the noise one evening, I found HOA contractors clearing a space near the old stream bed, apparently laying the groundwork for a community center without permits. I called the county. Not only did they confirm no such project had been approved, but they warned me that Karen had submitted forged maps to justify her encroachment. That's when I started digging through my family's archive, papers, surveys, letters my grandfather exchanged with local officials decades ago. Every page strengthened my legal right, but also painted a bigger picture. Karen wasn't just after my cabin. She wanted control of the entire valley. She wanted to rezone, develop, and sell. She saw these woods as an untapped luxury investment, not a home passed down through generations. I reached out to neighbors quietly at first. Many were scared, silenced by Karen's HOA fines or social pressure, but a few had also received strange notices. Some even had liens placed on their homes over tiny, fabricated rule violations. We met in barns, on porches, and in the back of the general store. Slowly, a resistance was forming. Karen had underestimated something old money always forgot. Rural folks don't like to be pushed. We move slow, but when we do act, it's permanent. The final straw came when Karen ordered her team to tear down an old wooden trailhead sign built by my grandfather. It wasn't just a marker, it was a memory. I arrived moments too late, just as the last beam fell. I picked it up, splintered and stained with oil, and made a promise right then. She would regret ever stepping onto Monroe land. No more patience, no more silence. The war had begun. The day after the police left, I stood on my porch with a mug of coffee and looked down at the valley as fog hugged the hills. The quiet wasn't peace anymore. It was pressure. Pressure building behind every tree, inside every home, on every path Karen had marched her power through. People avoided eye contact now. The ones who used to wave, even bring pies, now pulled their kids inside when I drove past. Karen had done her work well. She'd painted me as a hostile intruder, a menace, a squatter, even though the land beneath their shoes still answered to me. I didn't retaliate, not at first. I watched, I listened. I drove my old truck through every gravel curve of the valley, saw the new sign she was putting up, HOA speed limit 15, private access road, authorized residents only. Never mind the fact that the road wasn't hers. Never mind that I built it with my grandfather's hands when this was just wilderness. She stood at intersections pointing, issuing citations to delivery drivers, to hikers, to me. She had a clipboard, a badge made from laminated printer paper, and eyes full of venom. Then she started sending letters, notices posted to trees left in mailboxes, unauthorized structures, noise complaints, noncompliance with HOA aesthetic standards. My cabin had been there for 40 years. Karen had been here for 3. When I didn't respond to the letters, she escalated. She blocked the road one morning, used her nephew's lifted truck and 2 lawn chairs with plastic chain between them. She sat in a folding chair with a walkie-talkie. "You're trespassing," she said when I pulled up, "private property." I rolled my window down slow. "Is that right?" I asked. "You're on HOA grounds, sir." I didn't argue. I just showed her the map, a county plat from 1968. Every parcel, every line, every square foot from the top of the hill to the curve of the stream. Mine, her face drained of color. She blinked hard. This isn't official. It's more official than your chair," I said, and drove straight through the chain. It snapped like thread. She called the cops again, but this time I was ready. When the sheriff arrived, I had every deed, every registered document laid out on the tailgate. He took one look, nodded, and said, "Ma'am, you're blocking a public easement. You'll need to move the vehicle." Karen exploded, said I threatened her, said I rammed the chain on purpose. She screamed about hostile neighbors, about how she was preserving the neighborhood. "Ma'am," the deputy said, "you can't preserve what don't belong to you." She was warned. She was furious, but she didn't stop. Next came the sabotage. First, my well pump stopped working, then the generator. Then someone poisoned the feed I kept for the deer during winter. I installed trail cams. I stayed up at night with a flashlight in hand waiting. One night around 2 a.m., I caught a figure near the fence. Hood up, flashlight in one hand, something metallic in the other. I flicked mine on and yelled. They bolted. I never saw a face, but I found the spray paint the next morning, "Get out," in blood red across my barn. That was the final straw. I drove into town and filed the paperwork, not for a restraining order, for an injunction against the HOA. I brought receipts, I brought maps, I brought history. A judge reviewed it quietly, carefully, and signed it. The HOA was operating illegally on over 60% of their claimed land. Karen had extended her rule past what she legally controlled, and now they'd been caught, but that wasn't the end. The HOA called an emergency meeting. Karen riled the crowd, claimed I was trying to destroy the community, that I was bullying her, that the valley would fall into ruin if I had my way. I sat in the back of the rec center and watched them yell. Then when it got quiet, I stood up. I didn't raise my voice. I spoke plainly about history, about land, about how my family cleared the trees and laid the gravel and dug the water lines, about how I let hikers cross my land for free, about how I'd never taken a dime from the HOA because I never needed it. Then I pulled out the title to the land beneath the road. If I wanted, I said, I could shut down the only access into your subdivision, right now. The room fell silent. But I won't, because this land doesn't belong to people like Karen. It belongs to people who respect it, who respect each other. Karen stormed out, but the damage had already been done. The community was waking up. The night had fallen quiet, but the storm inside the valley was only gaining momentum. After the public fallout at the town hall and Karen's growing paranoia about Jack's true reach, her tactics took a sharp, darker turn. Jack, though composed, was no longer reactive. He was preparing a defense not just for his land, but for his legacy. It began with whispers from the town's edge. Old-timers spoke in hushed tones, recalling how Jack's grandfather once saved the valley during a drought by redirecting a creek through handmade stone channels. Jack's blood ran with the same resilience. He knew every crack in the mountainside, every tree that bent from wind, every shortcut the forest hid. And now his legacy was being mocked by someone who didn't even know what the soil beneath her feet carried. Karen's moves became erratic. One morning, surveyors hired by the HOA showed up again, but this time accompanied by a film crew and a lawyer in a tailored suit. They began setting up markers, placing signs that read "property in dispute," and passing out pamphlets to neighbors, suggesting that Jack's ownership of the cabin and much of the valley was under review due to historical discrepancies. Jack said nothing. He let them work under the shade of his pines, watching from his porch with a quiet smirk. Because what Karen didn't know, what no one seemed to bother checking, was that Jack had just recently acquired copies of the original land patents signed over a century ago by the federal government, with documents that hadn't seen daylight since the courthouse fire of 1943. But Karen wasn't one to retreat. As her accusations failed to gain traction with local officials, she moved to discredit Jack personally. She printed flyers that called him a squatter with no proof, organized a community cleanup that deliberately dumped trash at the trail heads Jack had restored, and even painted over historical markers near his land. But the final straw came when she filed a public nuisance report against Jack, claiming his dogs barked too loud at night and his cabin lighting violated wildlife regulations. That triggered a police visit. Flashing blue lights pierced the forest shadows one evening, and 2 officers approached Jack's porch. Jack greeted them with calm, inviting them inside. They explained they were just following up on a series of complaints. Jack nodded, stood up, and walked them to a bookshelf. From it, he pulled out a thick binder with tabs, receipts, permits, property deeds, and photos dating back generations. He laid them out on the old wooden table. The officers spent nearly an hour flipping through them in silence. When they left, they not only apologized, but one of them muttered, "This valley would be nothing without your family, Mr. Walker." Meanwhile, Karen watched from her SUV across the tree line. Her binoculars trembled in her hands as she realized the cops weren't leaving with Jack. They were leaving with respect for him. Her plan to weaponize law enforcement had backfired, but instead of retreating, she shifted strategy again. Karen, along with 2 HOA board members and a legal advisor, filed a lawsuit alleging that Jack's ownership documents were falsified and requested a court-ordered land freeze. Jack, upon receiving the summons, smiled faintly. He reached under his floorboards and pulled out a waterproof case. Inside were aerial maps, geological surveys, and a notarized agreement signed by the previous owner of the valley, who had transferred the land to Jack's father decades earlier. Jack hired a quiet, sharp-witted land rights attorney from Denver, an old college friend of his father. The moment the lawsuit hit public records, Jack's team filed a countersuit for defamation and malicious prosecution. In court, Jack stood in boots and a clean plaid shirt, a man of the land. Karen wore a designer suit, flanked by advisors and publicists. The judge, a lifelong local who grew up hunting in Jack's woods, glanced at the 2 parties and said, "I've seen some land disputes in my time, but this one smells more like a political tantrum than a property conflict." Karen's case unraveled quickly. Her hired surveyor admitted under oath that he was paid to ignore key property lines. The court threw out the HOA claims and awarded Jack damages for slander and legal fees. Karen's face flushed red as cameras clicked. But even after losing in court, she wasn't done. She couldn't stand the idea of losing control. She launched an online campaign claiming that Jack's win was the result of small-town corruption. She poured money into YouTube ads, fake social media accounts, and neighborhood newsletters questioning Jack's ethics. But Jack didn't respond online. He responded with action. He opened parts of the valley for community picnics, hired locals to help with conservation work, and invited children from nearby schools to plant trees on Arbor Day. His quiet leadership began to reshape the valley's image, no longer a battleground, but a sanctuary. The tide was turning, and Karen knew it. She drove past the valley overlook one evening and saw dozens of families gathered, laughing around fire pits, grilling food near Jack's old cabin, waving to him as he stood in the doorway. She drove off without stopping. Her power was slipping through her fingers, but deep inside, she was already preparing her final strike, the one she thought would bury Jack's legacy forever. Only she had no idea that Jack had just discovered something that would flip the entire HOA empire on its head. The storm wasn't over. It was just about to hit its peak. The mountain air was colder than usual that morning, sharp with tension and the weight of everything that had unfolded over the past weeks. Jack stood on the porch of his cabin, arms folded, eyes scanning the valley that had once been his peaceful retreat and had now become a battlefield. The fog clung to the trees, wrapping the forest in a thick shroud, hiding the scars of conflict beneath a blanket of silence. But Jack knew the war wasn't over yet. It was about to enter its final, most dangerous phase. Inside the HOA compound, Karen was in crisis mode. The news had finally broken. Local media had picked up the story of the HOA president attempting to seize property from a rightful owner who turned out to own the entire valley. Reporters camped outside her office, questioning her leadership. Board members were turning on her, angry at being manipulated into a losing war. But Karen wasn't the type to surrender. No, she was cornered, and cornered animals fight back with desperation. That afternoon, Jack received a summons. Not from the HOA, not from some backroom lawyer, but from the State Environmental Commission. Someone had filed complaints about illegal use of water rights, unauthorized dam structures, wildlife endangerment, and improper forestry operations, all under Jack's name. The sheer volume of accusations was laughable, but it forced an official investigation. Jack saw the handwriting all over it. Karen had pulled one last trick. She couldn't beat him in the valley, so she was trying to drag the fight into state courtrooms, hoping to drown him in red tape. Jack drove into town to meet with his legal team, flanked by the same community members who had once been skeptical of him. Now they rallied behind him, volunteering documents, statements, anything to help. Jack's old friend and forest ranger, Cole, brought in decades of land use records that clearly proved ownership, stewardship, and environmental compliance. But while Jack was gone, Karen made her final move. Under cover of night, she sent in contractors, some hired, others likely coerced, to begin dismantling Jack's private access road. Heavy machinery rumbled through the valley, tearing up gravel, felling trees, and setting up barriers. It was a blatant last-ditch effort to isolate Jack and reclaim some level of control. She thought he'd panic. She thought cutting him off would finally break him. What she didn't know was that Jack had anticipated this. Surveillance drones he'd set up weeks ago caught the entire operation on video. Local law enforcement, who'd previously tried to stay neutral, now had irrefutable evidence of Karen's criminal trespassing, destruction of private infrastructure, and tampering with protected lands. The sheriff issued a warrant. Karen was arrested on site during a staged press event she'd planned to defend her actions. Cameras caught the moment her expression twisted from smug defiance to horrified disbelief as she was handcuffed in front of her supporters. The valley cheered, not out of cruelty but because justice had finally reached the mountaintop. Jack didn't celebrate. He didn't throw a party or mock her downfall. He simply walked the length of his property, pausing by the same lake that started it all. He looked out at the still waters and let out a deep breath. The war was over. The valley was his again, not just on paper but in peace. Months passed. The HOA was dissolved under state order. Karen's allies either resigned or were barred from future leadership roles. Jack set up a land trust, placing the valley under long-term environmental protection. He didn't need to profit off it. He just wanted to preserve it. Slowly, families returned. Not just new settlers, but old neighbors who had left when the HOA turned cruel. They brought back laughter, music, firelight on summer nights. Trails reopened, trees healed, the lake sparkled again, and Jack, no longer just a cabined dweller, became a steward of the valley's legacy. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the mountain ridge, casting long gold shadows across the trees, Jack stood once more on his porch. A young couple walked by and waved. "Thanks for keeping this place safe," they called. Jack just nodded, a quiet smile on his face, because sometimes revenge isn't about anger. Sometimes it's about standing your ground with truth, patience, and resilience, until the mountain itself remembers who it truly belongs to.